Thank you for joining us today, Bob Jordan. Bob, tell me a little bit about your background and the role that you've played in implementing Housing First in Ireland.
Well, John, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. Housing First has really been a programme in Ireland since 2011. There was a pilot programme in Dublin, and it's become mainstream since 2014. I suppose one of the things that's significant in Ireland is that Housing First is now a government programme, and I suppose my role from 2018 onwards was as National Director of Housing First, really ensuring that Housing First was available to everybody who needed it in Ireland across all 31 local authority areas that we have. Since then, I've taken up a role as Chief Executive of the Housing Agency, which really supports the government in delivering housing solutions across the country. And just recently, we've established a National Housing First office, a government office for Housing First. So I suppose maybe the main lesson from Ireland, John, would be that having Housing First as a government-sponsored programme is really important to get it to scale, given the level of resources required in terms of permanent housing, the wraparound health services, and the funding that's needed really for the voluntary bodies, the NGOs that are supporting Housing First tenants in their homes.
Thank you. I want to maybe focus in on the housing aspect. So in your experience, tell me about how housing options can play a significant role in people's recovery and reintegration into the community.
So I think the first thing to say about the housing is that we follow the Pathways Housing First model, the original model developed by Dr. Samson Beres, which talks about scattered site housing. So housing scattered in the community rather than in congregate settings, because that gives people the best opportunity to be supported, but also to integrate into the community. I think Housing First is a mainstream intervention, so people should be able to get social housing, private rented housing, and so on. Now, the reality is in Ireland, I think most people will get social housing either provided by local authorities or, our equivalent of community housing associations. But there are people living in the private rented sector. But obviously the issue with private rented very often is about the security of tenure and so on. So I would say the main thing is that it's a mainstream housing intervention, giving people the opportunity to, choose where they want to live within a community is really important. So the element of consumer choice is very important in terms of housing options. I know in most countries, you don't have an endless choice because there's a constriction in terms, but I think there has to be some real choices within the housing that's available.
Talking about those choices, what are some of the best examples that you've seen and why does that work?
Well, I think that, listen, sometimes there's standalone housing in the community and that's fine. I think the issue with apartment blocks is that you don't want an over concentration of Housing First tenants there. So let's say it's a scheme of 11 terraced houses. You wouldn't put more than maybe 2 Housing First tenants in there. I think when we're looking at apartments, we're also looking at own door access, because very often, I suppose, people moving around within corridors and so on can draw a little bit of attention to them, especially if they're still active in their addiction or they have mental health issues and so on. So I suppose in terms of choosing housing, we're trying to choose it in a way that allows that person to settle in the community. It does happen, and the primary reason that people lose their Housing First tenancies is because they lose control of their front door. Maybe people they've associated with in the street, come to their home and they sort of lose control of their home. This happens quite a bit. Mm-hmm. So very often, you need to maybe relocate that person to a different Housing First tenancy. That's one of the commitments of Housing First. And you might even, if there's been a lot of issues going on in a property, in a community, you might decide to rest that house from Housing First, not use it for Housing First, use it for general needs social housing or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So talking about this in terms of, can you share any experiences where you've seen poor housing options impacting on people's capacity to recover?
Yeah, well, I think, if people are given insecure housing or, maybe the housing doesn't really fit their needs, or, if they can't have their pets there, or, if they have a partner or so on. I think the reason it doesn't fit usually is because the person really hasn't had a choice in it, or else the choice that they've made, they realize, we do have people who've chosen to live in a particular area, and then they sort of say, listen, actually I'm well known in this area, so people are kind of targeting the house, or you know, my mates know where to find me. Perhaps it might be better if you move me somewhere else, and sort of people kind of learn as they go about that. Sometimes if we put people into an apartment development and there's big wide corridors and so on, and you know, they might draw maybe a little bit too much attention to themselves, and that could be an issue as well. So like the person's involvement in the selection of housing is really important, and sometimes people learn as they go. So what we find in the Housing First program, most people do stick in their first tenancy, but sometimes people need to learn a little bit more about themselves and the housing that fits them as part of the program.
Okay, thank you. I guess if I was to put a sort of a hat on that said, I'm interested in being part of a solution and developing housing options, what would be your message to anyone considering developing housing options that would lead towards ending homelessness?
Yeah, well, I think the most important thing is to give people, like the most important thing in Housing First is the promise of permanent housing and the promise of time unlimited supports. So that promise needs to be real. Also, rapid rehousing people is part of the Housing First program. So we do have people in Ireland who've received maybe 4 or 5 Housing First tenancies, and you know, maybe if you come back to me and talk to me in a couple of years' time, John, they might have had 7 or 8 tenancies, but that's the promise. Now, there is a small number of people for which Housing First doesn't work, and they may need long-term supported accommodation. In other words, a tenancy, but with 24-hour staff on-site support. But that's a smaller number of people. And I suppose my message would be, if you follow the Pathways Housing First model, maintain fidelity to that, you will get, 75 to 85% success rate. In fact, we're so confident about that in Ireland that we've built it into the contract. So here in Dublin, the Housing First provider is contractually obliged to deliver an 85% success rate. And if it goes below 80%, which it's never done, some corrective action has to be taken. So at the moment, I think the success rate is around 87%. So, follow the model, get the results. And that's because there's been so many, randomized control trials, evaluations of Housing First that say, if you put all the ingredients together, you get the results. And I suppose the most important thing is just that we've had people who've been on the streets, John, in some cases for decades, and those people have moved permanently out of homelessness. Sometimes, even for all of us who've been working on it for a long time, Housing First is still a miracle in terms of what it can achieve.
Yeah. Now, great advice, and thank you for taking the time to be part of our launch today. And we appreciate your sharing your experiences and wisdom with us today. Thank you.
You're more than welcome, John. Hello to everybody in Western Australia.